their way, but we need to get started. I want to welcome everyone to the third and final session. Again, remind everyone that as before, this is being live streamed, so please use the microphones. And again, following the conclusion of this panel, there'll be an opportunity for media and others to interact with our panelists. In this session, we're going to focus on the NCAA transfer rules. They've already been alluded to in a prior discussion. In January 2017, the NCAA Board of Directors established the Division I Transfer Working Group and charged it with examining transfer rules and developing recommendations for changes consistent with some guiding principles. This group is the third to examine transfer rules since 2012, so that tells you something about the difficulty the membership is experiencing in addressing issues that impact student-athlete well-being as well as competitive concerns. The session summary, which is in your meeting packets, provided some highlights of the current rules as well as provided some current NCAA research on transfer students. To highlight a couple of these data points as context for the panel, the rate of transfer by Division I men's basketball players between four-year colleges is among the highest of any sport. In fact, about 40% of all men's basketball players who enroll in a Division I school directly after high school depart that initial school by the end of their second year. The transfer issue is not just a men's basketball issue, but it certainly is a prominent one in the sport of men's basketball. We're going to hear from members of the NCAA Transfer Working Group, as well as from a member of the Committee on Academics, a group that is providing input in the review process. And we're very glad to have a coach's perspective and a student's perspective in this session as well. I won't review the extensive bios which you have in your packets, but I do want to introduce the panelists in the order that we've asked them to give their remarks. First, Jane Miller. Welcome, Jane. Senior Associate Athletics Director at the University of Virginia and Vice Chair of the NCAA Division I Transfer Working Group. Next to her is Rhonda Hatcher, Faculty Athletics Representative from Texas Christian University and a member of the NCAA Committee on Academics. And then we have Noah Knight, who is former men's basketball student athlete at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and incoming chair of the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee. And finally, Jamian Christian. Coach Christian deserves a really special introduction because he was just named the head men's basketball coach at Siena University just last week after serving as the head coach at Mount St. Mary's University for 6 seasons. He was married on Saturday, so he had a busy week, and he's delayed his honeymoon to be here with us today. So thank you all very much. And Jane, if we could begin with you.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Cartwright and Dr. Duncan, and all of the members of the commission for this opportunity to talk to you about transfers in the intercollegiate athletic space. And as a history buff, I also want to thank you for the opportunity to stay at the Willard. I went through all of the history up and down the hallways, and it's quite the place. As we are all aware, the frequency of transfer in Division I, including postgraduate athletics participation at a different school, is increasing and causing a number of concerns. While not all transfers are bad, a structure which many student athletes move from school to school is nevertheless unproductive, particularly with regard to academic outcomes. The question of what to do about it prompts a number of opinions, just as the Commission on Men's Basketball has, which typically falls somewhere between what's in the best interest of the student athlete and the best interest of the team. In other words, most people in the membership want us to do something that is meaningful, but they also do not want us to upset the competitive apple cart. This isn't the first time you as a commission have heard an NCAA member talk about the challenge prompted by the tug and pull between NCAA values and our membership's competitive interests. In many ways, that's why you were formed in 1989, to help ensure that the NCAA stay true to its mission in the face of increasing competitive pressures. The transfer environment in Division I at this point is something significant must be done to avoid those competitive interests outweighing what we as a higher education association stand for. The NCAA working group that I serve on has been working diligently for 18 months to form recommendations aimed at improving the transfer space, sifting through the opinions from varied audiences to reach what we believe are the most sensible and defensible concepts. When it comes to Division I student athletes, transfer rates vary significantly across sports, which suggests that factors specific to particular sports may play a direct role in student athlete movement. Transfer rates in men's basketball, as you have just heard, stand out in particular and have become a lightning rod for debate about transferring in general. 80% of Division I transfers report, and a recent report cited athletic reasons for their reason for transferring. Among men's basketball, football, and baseball, student athletes, only 22% claimed academics as a factor in their decision to transfer. Regardless of why students transfer, most troubling is the effect on academic outcomes. In some, transfer delays a student athlete's academic progress to a degree, increasingly opens the door for third parties to selfishly influence transfer decisions, creates a negative perception around Division I athletics, creates a destabilizing impact on teams as students increasingly leave one school for another, and in the postgraduate space, it creates perceptions of challenges with the integrity of a student's admission and legitimate pursuit of a graduate degree. The first thing the working group did was to propose changing the current permission to contact structure. Many of you in the room are familiar with the transfer process, but for those of you who are not, the gist is that student athletes who wish to transfer must first receive permission from their current institution. If the institution denies permission, the student athlete cannot receive athletics aid for the first year after transfer. I think most of us, not just in the working group, but also in the membership, see this as problematic. Accordingly, the working group proposed changing the permission to contact structure to a notification of intent to transfer model, which accomplishes two positive outcomes. One, it returns the decision to the students where it belongs. Two, the notification model eliminates the ability for coaches and schools to restrict aid to student athletes after transfer. The notification model, as our working group has structured it, also strengthens rules and sanctions around unethical recruiting and would require the use of a national database to identify student athletes who have notified institutions regarding transfer, which not only would streamline the transfer process, but also add guardrails around tampering. The working group believes that the notification model will represent a major victory for student athlete well-being, particularly the provision regarding access to aid. The proposal is currently in the legislative cycle and will be decided in June. These are all important changes that align with the principles laid out last year by the NCAA Division I Board of Directors. The working group is still working to build consensus around the uniform eligibility rule, and again, there are a large range of ideas about this. I think I neglected to say that some of the things that the Division I Board of Directors directed us to do with their guiding principles was the primacy of academics, was trying to have a uniform rule for all sports unless there's data and research that tells us differently, and also that we need to have the least restrictive rules for our student athletes. As you heard earlier, the Commission of Men's Basketball passionately recommended that men's basketball sits out 1 year after transfer. With over 600 men's basketball transfers currently, the Commission is adamant, and I say adamant, that additional transfers in this sport would create chaos, something that the sport does not need at this particular time. For these reasons, the Transfer Working Group is pumping the brakes on the eligibility rule for immediate play upon transfer to seek membership input throughout the summer and spring conference meetings that will shortly be beginning. There are 3 eligibility concepts under discussion by the working group right now. The status quo, as you know about, where 4 sports, basketball, football, baseball, and ice hockey, sit out a year upon transfer, and all other sports must sit a year, but also have the opportunity for an exception to play immediately if approved by the departing institution. Second, an academically based uniform transfer rule that ties immediate competitive eligibility to classroom performance and not the sport that they play. This would be available only one time during a student-athlete's collegiate participation, and the student must meet percentage of degree requirements from the departing institution and the receiving institution, and also have a cumulative grade point average of at least a 3.0 and up to a 3.5. Third, a rule where all students sit out a year of residency upon transfer. This would eliminate the one-time transfer exception for 68% of student athletes, but provide uniformity. And I think that's a really important stat to note. Additionally, the working group has asked the Collegiate Commissioners Association to review its national letter of intent policy and consider a change that would permit a student who has signed an NLI to transfer without sitting out a year if the head coach leaves. The transfer working group is also interested in membership feedback on the concept that would change financial aid rules for postgraduate transfers. Only 37% of those who enroll in postgraduate programs receive a graduate degree. This creates difficulties for those schools and programs when they are denying admissions to other qualified applicants. The most important things to remember about the working group's recommendations are: permission to contact would be replaced by notification to transfer. Student athletes would have the opportunity to receive a scholarship immediately upon entering their second institution. The penalty for tampering would be elevated, and a national database would provide transparency to the process. While the eligibility rule that surrounds the immediate opportunity to play right away and the postgraduate space are future topics for us. Our work is not done. I want to thank you. I'm glad to answer questions at the end of the presentation. And I would say finally that the working group is pleased with its progress to date, and we feel like we have made significant progress in this space. As noted earlier, this is the 3rd attempt at solving this issue. It's complicated. There are so many tentacles to it that has taken us time just to get through our first phase. There's more to come, and we're excited to be able to make a difference in this particular process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Rhonda, we'll go to you.
Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate that. I am here, and I will speak today as a representative of 2 different groups. I am a member of the, as has been mentioned, a member of the NCAA Committee on Academics. I am also at an institution that's a member of the Big 12 Conference, and there's some different ideas coming out of those 2 groups, and I've been asked to speak to both of those. I'll also speak just as a faculty athletics representative, but please be mindful of the fact that there's a wide range of opinion among about this issue among faculty athletics representatives, and I may even be in a minority in my opinion. Regarding the Committee of Academics, at the April 2018 meeting, the committee voted to make a formal recommendation to the transfer working group that transferring student athletes in all sports with a grade point average of something between a 3.0 and a 3.3, so not up to a 3.5, who also meet progress towards degree at the new institution would be immediately eligible for competition. Those not meeting the standard would have to sit out a year of competition at the new institution before competing. This recommendation was based on a lot of data that we looked at from Division I transfer student athletes across all sports. And the committee concluded that the data does not support requiring all student athletes with these high GPAs to sit out a year of competition upon transfer, and also noted that a mandatory year in residence may pose a financial burden on these student athletes. As an example of the data, the NCAA data shows that for a 4.4 transfer with a 3.0 cum GPA, the probability of graduating within 5 years of initial college enrollment is 72%, and that this probability actually increases to 78% for a 3.3 GPA. And not surprisingly, the probability of graduating is lower for those with lower GPAs. The committee did not recommend a transfer exception for student athletes due to a head coach departure because no data exists to suggest that student athletes would benefit academically in this situation with transferring, although it should be noted that no research has actually been conducted in this area. That's why the data doesn't exist. So this recommendation to the transfer worker was supported very strongly by the committee. I will be honest that I was the only dissenting vote, so I do want to be clear about that. I'll talk next about what we in our conference refer to as a Big 12 concept, and this concept was born out of, it was sort of at our spring meetings, it was born out of a concern that an academic benchmark would have a very disparate impact on revenue sports and on minority student athlete. Specifically, what the Big 12 concept states is a couple of things. One is that student athletes may transfer without permission of the current institution. So, in other words, we're in favor of the notification to transfer legislation. It also calls for all student athletes to fulfill a year residence requirement at the new institution before being eligible for competition, unless they've earned a BA at the most recent institution, their head coach has departed, and they're not transferring to an institution where their head coach has moved on to, or that NCAA sanctions limiting postseason have happened at their current institution, or that the student wasn't on financial aid. In addition, the Big 12 concept calls for the first-time transfer who is not immediately eligible for competition to receive a one-year extension on the 5-year clock if necessary to ensure they don't lose a year of competition. The arguments that are being made for the proposal is that it creates uniformity across all sports, which is one of the charges. And the other argument is that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that data clearly indicate that in broad strokes at least, transfer has a negative impact, implications both on likelihood of graduation and time to degree. So now I'll move on to my personal view. My personal view lines mostly up with the Big 12 concept. Some concerns about the head coach departure portion because it's complicated. So I'll stick in sort of in my lane about the academic thing. And so what I really want to address is the academic benchmark and why all of the Big 12 faculty athletics representative, including myself, are taking exception to it. And so what we would really like to do is see all student athletes have a year in residence. So there are several reasons. One is that the NCAA data shows that the GPA benchmark would have a disparate impact on student athletes in revenue sports, namely men's basketball and football. For example, only 30% of men's basketball student athletes would meet a 3.0 GPA benchmark. That's the lowest among all sports, while football at 31% would have the second lowest percentage. With a higher standard of a 3.3 GPA, only 13% of men's basketball and 15% of football student athletes would meet the 3.3 standard. The data also shows that an academic benchmark would have a disparate impact on black student athletes versus white student athletes. The data shows that an academic threshold set at a 3.0 would be met by 70% of white student athletes across all sports, and only 31% of black student athletes would meet the threshold. The disparity by race gets even more pronounced at higher GPA standards. Furthermore, if we decide to use a GPA threshold based on the data, exactly where to set that threshold, in my view, is a judgment call. It's not something that's clearly dictated by the data. We currently give the loss of the retention point in the APR for student athletes that transfer with a 2.6 GPA or above. And that threshold, when it was originated, was based on the idea that those students would maintain a 2.0 at the destination institution. And currently, by NCAA rules, that's considered satisfactory academic progress. So the question has been raised, not just by me, but by others, is why are we setting a higher GPA standard thresholds for these transfer student athletes than we have for APR forgiveness points? The one more issue is that, and I addressed this earlier, that in broad strokes, the data, NCAA data shows this, that transfer graduates at every single level of GPA actually perform not as well as non-transfers. For example, as I mentioned earlier, 4.4 transfers with a 3.0 GPA have a 72% chance of graduating within 5 years. However, for non-transfers with these 3.0 GPAs, this percentage is 85%. So there's a 10% difference even at that level. And the differences in graduations of transfers versus non-transfers demonstrate that even for student athletes with high GPAs, the transfer has a negative impact. So in summary, I think that to avoid, and my Big 12 faculty athletics representative colleagues also feel this way, and also the athletic directors, that to avoid possible criticism by the media, and I'm not a lawyer, but possibly even legal challenges, the NCAA should not adopt a GPA benchmarks transfer rule that clearly benefits a higher percentage of white student athletes over black student athletes, and would clearly benefit students in non-revenue sports more than those in revenue sports, especially because this rule, again, the GPA cutoff, is a bit of a judgment call. I fully understand the concerns people have about the possible financial burden a sitting out a year might impose on institutions and student athletes. I have a particular concern about student athletes in equivalency sports that are not on full scholarships, and this being a financial issue. I think that issue has to be carefully considered. I'm very pleased that the Transfer Working Group decided to, I think, as Jane put it, put the brakes on this for a while so we can really have conversations at our conference meetings and throughout the membership to decide the best way to proceed with this very difficult issue. Thank you.
Rhonda, before I go to Noah, would you go back to your statement about head coach departure? I think you said you were the only dissenting voice. Would you help us understand a little bit more about why?
Oh, no, actually, to be clear, I was the only dissenting voice. It wasn't head coach departure. It was on the Committee on Academics recommendation for the GPA threshold. On our committee, at the April meeting, I was the only one who spoke out against the threshold. And as far as I could tell from the feel of the room, is everybody else was actually in favor of the recommendation that was forwarded. Regarding the head coach departure thing, I love what the Transfer Worker Group is talking about in terms of the NLI and letting some of the student athletes get out of or be able to transfer from some institution they committed to if the coach leaves right away. Regarding other head coach departures, I don't think I'm by myself on this at all, that there's some concerns about that and the impact on possible, I think the word some people have used is programs getting decimated by all the student athletes departing, and maybe what effect that has on the student athletes that are left behind. I could go on that, but again, that's a little bit out of my lane.
Okay, well, thanks. I appreciate the clarification.
Okay.
We will now move to Noah.
All right, so first I'd like to say thank you to the Knight Commission for having me and for having the student athlete voice represented in this discussion, and also for what the Knight Commission stands for in intercollegiate athletics. To get into the transfer discussion, the NCAA Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee focuses on and prioritizes 3 areas in the transfer environment, and those are student athlete health and well-being, transparency, and student athlete and coach accountability. So with student athlete health and well-being, when a student athlete is unhappy at their current institution, it can affect multiple areas. It can affect their academics. It can affect the way they interact with their peers, with their teammates and their coaches, and it can also impact the type of relationship between a coach and a student athlete, and the way they take care of their bodies, which is a big deal when competing day in and day out. So student athletes not having to worry about the relationship with the coach being a problem when it comes to transferring, maybe wondering if their coach would restrict them on who they communicate with or restrict them on where they're able to go and receive financial aid, is a big win with a notification of transfer. And it's a huge weight lifted off the student athlete's shoulders, and is ultimately through the membership Transfer Working Group, Division I SAC has been endorsed. With transparency, once the conversation with a coach has happened with the student athlete and they've established that they'd like to transfer, the process becomes a lot more transparent with the database and the transfer portal. So once compliance places the name of the student athlete in the database within those 2 business days, this creates much more opportunity for the student athlete to be recruited and seen by coaches. And it also provides transparency for coaches to see who was able to be contacted without tampering implications. And overall, I believe this will benefit the system and the system will benefit the entirety of college sports. And student-athlete and coach accountability. I'm personally hopeful that this will lead to a better student-athlete coach relationship now that would be no leverage for a student or for a coach to restrict the student-athlete. And also, student-athletes need to be more accountable as they are now when it comes to transferring, and realize that there are consequences to transferring, and you're not always going to end up in a better situation than what you are in now. In regards to the transfer models being discussed, as of last time, the Division I SAC spoke extensively about transfer rules at the NCAA convention. The Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee did not endorse a model that created free agency, allowing student athletes to transfer and be immediately eligible with no expectations or no exceptions. In the academic model, the Division I SAC came to a consensus on a 3.0 GPA due to it being the least restrictive option that achieves uniformity and also prioritizes academic success. With a 3.0, there's a 70% chance or higher of graduating in a 5-year window. And this is at any point that a student athlete decides to transfer. So whether a freshman, sophomore, junior year, if you decide to transfer, there's a 70% chance or higher of you graduating. Then the concept of requiring all student athletes to take a year of residence upon transfer is now being considered. As of the last discussion, this was not endorsed by the Student Athlete Advisory Committee. This is seen as a more restrictive environment than what we are now. And one of the guiding principles that we've talked about with the transfer working group is to create an environment that is less restrictive than what we are dealing with for the student athlete. And also, it is understood with the Rice Commission report, the discussion around transfers may take a different direction. Really look forward to hearing from the Division I SAC student athletes in their respective conferences, as well as meeting with the transfer working group again and getting their thoughts and opinions with the recent Commission on College Basketball report. And in regards to the head coach change and postgraduate transfers, we haven't really had a great chance to discuss this extensively with the Division I SAC. However, I believe they would support this concept. The head coach change with the NLI and the transfers gives more options and opportunities to the student athlete. A big reason why prospective student athletes commit to the schools that they commit to is because of that relationship that they have with that head coach. And when the head coach leaves, sometimes the whole coaching staff changes, and having them the opportunity to reopen their recruitment process, take another visit to that school, see if they like the new head coach, I believe is a great concept. And postgraduate transfers, in an effort to reduce the amount of postgraduate transfers in the transfer environment, I believe them programs having to pay for the entire duration of that academic program is good, and for it to be a counter for that whole 2 years will make the coach, the institution, really think about what postgraduate transfers they bring in and if they're serious about their academics. So prioritizing academic success as well as competitiveness and whether or not they'll finish their respected program at that institution. So yeah, those are my remarks.
Thank you very much. Jamian?
Good day. Special thanks to the commission for allowing me to sit at this platform with many distinguished people today. I'm humbled to be included. I'm here to give a perspective of a head coach who works extremely closely with his student athletes. I was in the league, the Northeast Conference, where the league had been attacked by transfers, and that's not a diss to the Northeast Conference. It's just an understanding of the market and the landscape that we're into. We have a lot of different perspectives. We have a high major perspective, a mid-major perspective, and a low major perspective. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there are 3 different levels within the levels that we're working at in college basketball. A season ago, the Northeast lost 11 of its top 15 returning players. Personally, I've had 8 underclassmen transfer in the last 2 years, 6 transfers which would be considered up transfers, the other 2 that would be considered in the opposite direction. Also of note, in my time at the Mount 3 graduate transfers, which I don't count as a transfer because I believe it's all about graduation. My parents were first generation college graduates. I think there is a major value in the education that they're getting in a lot of different directions, but I do believe we should try to take care of our student athletes at the highest level that we can. Once you graduate, I think it's a win for everyone. It's a win for the student athlete. It's also a win for the university. Our student athletes have achieved a life-changing goal, and the university has helped to place a much more knowledgeable person to the world. It's a win, and it's different than an underclassman transfer. I think it's important to understand that it's different. However, they should be responsible for the full term of the graduation of the graduate school program. I think it's important for us to eliminate any of the academic abuses that exist within the college setting. And I think some do exist at the moment. And I think we've got to work really hard to keep the integrity of the word college or university to make sure that the education remains the most prominent point of their college experience. I make the promise to them and their families when they commit to me, I'm going to take care of their son. For me, this is not a conditional commitment. It's an unconditional commitment. Therefore, I choose to help them when they walk in the door and they have another opinion about another school. I do think when they come into my office, there is a pressure every year for the student athlete to make a decision, should I stay or should I go? I do think this is a trickle down to the one and done effect that it's had on college basketball because it allows you to look at each year or whether or not you're gaining everything you want, which I think as adults we realize that you're rarely going to have everything you want. But you learn through experiences, through time, that it's important to learn to appreciate what is around you while also being able to make a decision and having more education about the marketplace. There's important life lessons that you can learn, and the reason that I choose to help them when they come into the door is because I'm supposed to be the person that really committed to helping them grow and achieve and to make an impact in the world. Some coaches may act opposite. They may be disappointed. I just don't believe that's our place in the world. I think our place in the world is to help to educate them. Currently, we don't have a marketplace for them to be able to step out and gain education on the market. Quite honestly, I don't have guys who are necessarily going to the NBA. I'm fortunate if I have enough guys that are going into the developmental league, but we've put a lot of guys professionally overseas. So it's really, for them, they're going through this process and they really don't have an understanding of what it takes. They don't understand the market that it is once they step out and ask for a transfer. So I support the permission. I support the working group's ideas about changing that permission to contact. I think that's very important. I believe we've got to get this right for the majority, not just the minority. And I think it's very easy to look up and say the minority, the majority of guys are going to get all the accolades. They're going to be on ESPN. But I think as an adult working group, we've got to really look at the majority of guys that we can do a great job with and make sure that they're understanding the market that they're stepping into and that they're graduating. Again, the number of professionals that become professional basketball players is such a small number. I feel like we focus on those so much more than we do everyone else. And I think it's important for us to get it right for everyone else so that they can go out and change this world. I've agreed with many of the transfer recommendations. I think it's an excellent plan. I'm so appreciative of the working group working together and really coming together to come up with great solutions. The only thing I think is really missing is a period in time there where the student athlete has an opportunity to return back. The reality of it is I have these guys come into my office, and again, I've known them since they were 15 years old, so when they text me the night before that they want to meet, I already know what's going down. And I have a chance to sit with them, and they don't know where they're going to be able to go the majority of college basketball. They won't know until they have a chance to look into the market themselves and see where they're marketed at. But for them, there's a level of embarrassment about having a chance to come back. Right. And again, I've had 6 guys go high major in the last 2 years. I've tried to help them like no other coach in the world because I believe in them more than anyone else and I love them more than anyone else. But for those that don't have that opportunity and they're looking at a lateral experience, it is very hard for them to look to be able to come back. And I felt like if we're able to create a period in there, a period will do 2 things. Number one, it'll allow them and the coach an opportunity to re-recruit around and to bring them back into that fold. But number 2, and most importantly, it's going to allow them the chance to really finish off that semester well and to keep doing well academically. Understand a lot of this transfer market in men's basketball is happening in the month of April, and majority of students are graduating in May. Exams start early May, so I don't think that we're accounting for right now their academic success with the current model, and a lot of them are trying to figure out where they're going to transfer to while they're trying to finish up the semester. That's a very dangerous proposition for the majority of them. I think if we can correct that, I think we'll be in a good place. Again, I think our obligation is to get this right, and I'm appreciative of being a part of the conversation.
Jamie, and thank you very much. As you finish up, I just want to note that the Rights Commission stated that they didn't think NCAA schools were doing enough to develop the next generation of coaches. You don't sound like you need any development. Sounds like you've got a clear sense of commitment and values and passion about what you do. But what do you think about that statement? Do you agree with it, disagree with it? If you agree with it, do you have ideas about what might be done to invest in leadership and professional development of coaches?
God, I love the conversation about it, and I just think in so many different. I think right now we have a lot of leadership positions and not a lot of leaders, and I think it's our obligation of those at the forefront of college basketball to do a great job of trying to bring the next generation along. I think it's a simple process. I think it's about finding a core group of coaches. And again, everything kind of comes back to money, but finding a core group of coaches and having the right kind of investment into being able to create programs that way. I've been really interested in that over the last few years. I hope that someday my platform rises high enough where we can have a nice little tree underneath and we can work that way. That'd be really exciting. I've been fortunate to work with some great coaches. And that's sometimes in our business, that's the best way to learn. But I think making it an emphasis becomes really important. I think we're all responsible for doing that.
Thanks very much. Commissioners, it's your turn for questions. Christine?
Hi, Rhonda, I had a question for you because full disclosure, I serve on the transfer working group with Jane and Noah. We're not ganging up here. I just had a question. Your concern about the academic benchmark with respect to the fairness of that. If we are to look to somewhere between 3.0, 3.3, 3.5, we haven't landed on a number. If the concern is students in the high-profile sports or students along racial lines wouldn't have a fair access to playing right away based on that academic benchmark. But right now, the students in 5 sports, including the high-profile ones, and many of the black student athletes are in those sports. Right now, their chance of playing right away is 0. So there's no place to go but up. So some, as you look at the data, and especially I believe the data right at the 3.0 level, starts to bring the chances of students in those sports and along racial lines up to a comparable extent to others. So that's my first question. And then the other question is with your idea from the Big 12 FARs about everyone should sit as a consistent rule, then how do you explain why all freshmen don't have to sit? If it's based on academics that you have to sit, then how can a freshman understand college and play right away, but now when a student who presumably has learned something about college and goes to another, why would they all then have to sit if they didn't have to do it when they first got on a campus?
Let's see, I kept track of all of the questions. So I think I'll address the particular issue of the Big 12's concern about the way that the numbers break down. It's race and it's also revenue sport. It's both. And I'm aware of the data that right now, okay, none of them are immediately eligible. So this is a better setup. But in some sense, I don't like the argument because we're really a lot of them still won't be eligible. Particularly if you go up to like a 3.3 level, a whole bunch of them won't be eligible. And some of the scary statistics is that if you actually look at just in particular, black student athletes in football at a 3.0 level, only 18% of them would be eligible, and at a 3.3 level, it's 6%. So it's just almost none of them, and the basketball numbers are about the same. So you're trading something, but you're not really opening up transfers to those students. You're just changing which students are eligible. And I'm trying to remember what all the different questions you asked. You also asked about, I think, just the issue of having students sit out a year. I think, and what I didn't really address is that, because I was sort of trying to address the academic benchmark, is that the negative aspects of just the recruiting, atmosphere where students, while they are in college, I think could be possibly distracted by just the possibility of looking for another opportunity and being recruited is an academic distraction to all students. So I'm not crazy about, particularly in these high-profile sports, them being highly recruited while they are students at our institutions. I don't think it's good for them academically. And then that's really the argument. Whereas coming in as freshmen, they're being recruited out of high school. That's sort of a different situation. And what was the other question? I'm sorry, I didn't keep track of all of them. That was it? Okay.
I'm just curious about, there's been talk about trying to cite schools for unethical conduct with respect to transfers. And I've not heard a lot about schools being cited for unethical behavior or tampering with respect to transfers. Is there data that suggests that there's a lot of schools that have been cited? Jane, I don't know if you have any information, and depending on that answer, I have a follow-up.
I don't think we have hard data on that, but the anecdotal information that we get is that we hear constantly that this has been going on for years and years and years. And I think that Jay Billis sort of alluded to that and other people on the panel. So it is supposedly going on at high numbers and with the intent of increasing the tampering to a higher level. The hope is that the higher penalty perhaps will discourage some of it. The other piece that goes along with this is that as we roll this out, we feel like there should be an educational piece that goes to not only student athletes, goes to coaches, it goes to others in the arena where perhaps our student athletes may be reaching out for people, so that we think there's a big educational piece that should go with this as well.
Well, that's partly why I asked the first question, because my sense is that no one's dropping a dime on anybody for unethical behavior, and this is a typical situation where we've known that the shoe companies and the AAU stuff, there's that nexus that's been going on for 40 years. Everybody's known about it, but nobody's wanted to drop a dime on anybody. And now we're having the same conversation about recruiting and tampering, and the will to expose people who you think are tampering with your student athletes is the only way that we're going to get the thing cleaned up. And yet nobody's got the will to do that, or hasn't up until now. So my worry is that even though we might make the punishments greater, there's still not a really great mechanism for sniffing that out. My own experience as an athletic director, when I've had student athletes come looking for the release, is when we've had reason to expect or suggest that there was tampering involved, I've not allowed the approval. And I've had some uncomfortable conversations with colleagues at other schools who didn't appreciate the fact that I was going to keep that young person from going to that school because I had reason to think that they messed around with him or her. And so I can tell you that there were some really nasty names thrown out about us for doing that. And the parents didn't appreciate it either. And yet, part of what we need is leadership where people are going to say, no, we're supposed to have a set of values here, and I have reason to believe that you've tampered with the student athlete. We're not going to allow that person to go there. But there's so few cases where people have gotten whacked for tampering with a recruit because they're going through third parties, and people are whispering in the kid's ear and saying, we already know that there's a scholarship here. If you decide to leave, we've got you set up. And so I'm concerned that we're hoping that putting more teeth in a rule will help, and yet if people aren't willing to expose what's going on, I'm not sure if it's going to matter.
And we've heard that, Peter, from a number of people that say that how are we really going to enforce it? How are we going to cut down on it? And I think we've heard, as within the Commission for Men's Basketball, is that it's going to take everybody. It's going to take more athletic directors like yourself who hold up the transfer and the approval for it. So it's been something we've talked about. We're not sure about other additional steps we could take with that besides making it a higher penalty, besides putting in an educational piece, but what we can't legislate ethics. I think that was already said today at one point. So it's going to take all of us. It's going to take athletic directors, presidents, all parties to try and cut down on the tampering.
Well, wasn't there any thought originally given to the idea that not only was there concern about year in residence with respect to academic success when athletes transferred to get acclimated and focus on their academics, but wasn't there at least some concern or attempt to limit the tampering by having some sort of a consequence of the transfer, that someone wouldn't be eligible right away? So stop tampering because you're not going to get access right away. You're going to have to at least sacrifice a year of a scholarship, and that person's going to have to sit out. Is that been a part of the thinking or
That's
not?
been a part of the discussion, that we've always looked at accountability on both sides when we're talking about all of these issues, whether it's the institution, the individual student athlete. And if a student athlete were found to be involved in the tampering, they could potentially have to sit right away. That has been part of the discussion, yes.
Thank you very much. I can tell you there's nobody happier than Coach Christian leaving Mount St. Mary, the Mount, than the folks at Siena are happy to get him, but the folks at Robert Morris are happy to see you go, because you are a heck of a coach. I've sat down at the Mount and watched you coach those young men, and you are like President Cartwright mentioned, you're a heck of a coach, and you don't need much developing. You're doing a lot of developing on your own. I wanted to put that on the record for you. I'm gonna make a couple of global comments. I'm gonna have a question for Noah / probably Jane. You know, you think about this whole idea of transfers. Remember that about 33% or 35% of students will transfer at least once that are non-student athletes. It's becoming more and more norm for people not just to transfer once, but to transfer multiple times. Now, here's the issue, though. Just because they can do it doesn't mean they ought to do it. And we're finding, when you look at persistence and graduation rates, it's better to transfer when you are a stronger student. Those stronger students happen to be maybe academically a higher performance, happen to be white. So I'm not saying that black students shouldn't transfer or shouldn't have the right to do it or whatever, but just recognizing that the stronger you are academically, the better chance you have of feeling, sort of absorbing the buffets of going to someplace new. I encourage my fellow commissioners and the folks in this group to look at what Georgia State's doing around persistence and graduation in general, because that's what we want people to do. To and through, arrive and thrive, not just go there and fumble around. Get engaged and get focused as a student. It's really hard. And so when you're buffing it around, even if you think you're going to be playing for the Knicks later on, it's problematic. So that's just kind of a global concept to remember. And this is what that building down there is getting us on about, rightfully so, that being the Capitol, rightfully so, that we need to be thinking about outcomes and ensuring that people are getting to and through. And anything that puts a buffets that needs to be brought into the conversation. That's just kind of a global comment. My last two sort of questions, I want to make sure I'm clear on the APR piece. This is probably Jane / Rhonda. When it comes to, because I mean, I'm like Jamie, and we're in the same boat with Robert Morris. I had Jarius Lyles, Coach Toole had Jarius Lyles from UMBC, Marquise Reed at Clemson, and Rodney Pryor from Georgetown, all on the same team at one point. And now they went on to other places in sort of great glory. We don't want to be punished as a mid-major or high mid-major because somebody heads out. And so if they head out with a 2.6, then our APR isn't dinged. I remember correctly, and APR is important because of academic units, the way NCAA dollars go out. So we want to keep our students, ironically, the incentive's not perverse. Keep your students' grades up, your basketball teams, as they transfer, at least you get the academic, you don't lose part of your academic credit because the APR piece there. I want to make sure I have those numbers right to that effect. And then my last question is for Noah. Noah, isn't part of this all just on the basketball side, this the insatiable appetite or the belief that everybody thinks they're going to go pro? Mark Emmert says that 40% of D3 players think they're going to go pro. They're not. I used to be at a D3 school as a president. So many players that step in. When Coach Toole brings players around to me, almost to a person, they say, I'm going to go pro. So Noah, what about that just mindset piece in terms of, people just having a distorted understanding of their chances of actually making it pro anyway, from like Jay Billis playing overseas, or even in the G League, where Rodney Pryor is, I think, right now, are playing in the NBA or something like that. So those two questions.
It's my understanding that the Committee on Academics is looking at a model of some sort so that the APR point can be regained by the institution that the transfer student left. And I think that's probably mostly a question for Rhonda, above and beyond that.
We've had mild discussions about that, but really, I think we really haven't dug into that. A lot of it is because we're still dealing with the transfer question, so it's one of those questions that we'll probably address later. But your question about the 2.6 is definitely the 2.6 gives you APR forgiveness, and that's why I've heard among just people in the membership, there are some questions about why the transfer transfer GPA for immediate eligibility is so much higher. But in terms of the 2.6, you're exactly right.
Yeah, so to the mindset of the student athlete thinking they'll go pro, I mean, the NCAA does a great job of letting everybody know that only a minute percentage of student athletes actually do reach the professional level. I think that falls on the institution to educate these student athletes that, hey, while your aspirations are valid, you need to have a plan B. And our institution at UMKC, we have programs, we have student athlete development. Just as a student athlete, we need to be more engaged with those development processes so we can succeed in that next phase, whether it's professionally or whether it's as a professional basketball player or in another profession. So I think it falls on the institutions.
Thank you very much, Noah. And I think we ought to rename the commission in your name because you are on top of it. Appreciate what you're bringing to this, buddy. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to President Howard's question is that if you look at the way schools recruit, when they do have an athlete that makes it to the NBA or the NHL or the NFL, they celebrate it big time. So the pictures are on the walls that lead out of the locker room, and it's in their materials, and they reference it when they go into the home to speak that, you can make your dreams come true if you want to play at the highest level with a chance to go further and still get a quality education. This is the place to come to do that. So we're all guilty of using that language, whether it's a kid that we think is just going to be a fairly decent contributor or someone that's really got the kind of potential to play at the next level.
Well, I want to say after the last session, it's a pleasure to be reminded that we're at educational institutions. I wanted to ask, I know, Jane, you said you hadn't got to the graduate transfer issue yet, but as the person who chaired the Committee on Academics when we allowed that, and who thinks of it as a blemish on his own contribution to the NCAA, I'm curious if you have ideas about how the graduate transfer rule is working at the moment, and do you have any ideas about how that might be improved?
The two, I would say, I'm a little scared to answer it since you were one of the initiators of the rule, but the two things that we're looking at, number one is whether or not the scholarship is a 2-year program for a graduate degree, and a young man or young woman takes a graduate program, and they don't play but 1 year, that the institution has to count that money for 2 years. The second piece is that when a student athlete goes to a graduate program, is that if they enter a 2-year program and they stay, but they only have 1 year of eligibility, the institution must pay for that second year. So I think it's fixing the fact that some want to finish their degree, but they're only being funded for 1 year. And they're also the problem where they're going into a graduate program, but they're only participating 1 year. And that's where the opportunities for other qualified students are being somewhat limited because they're taking up spots. And that is a little bit of a black eye on us. So I think the postgraduate transfer space is a place where we have a lot of discussion ahead of us. I would say when we started, we thought we were going to tick that one off. We thought that was going to be the easy one. And then we started talking about it and getting into some of the innuendos of it. So we're back again, and one of the things that we will look for from our membership over the spring and over the summer is their feedback on the postgraduate space to see what they think about those two pieces.
Now, can I just ask for your sense of, from a student-athlete point of view, about graduate transfers and whether those kinds of requirements on the institution would be an improvement or a detriment?
I think they would be an improvement. While student-athletes transfer for mostly competitive reasons, seeing an academic piece tied to it, as well as having the institution kind of meet the student-athlete in the middle, saying, hey, you can compete with us for 1 year, but on the other, we expect you to complete your graduate degree program as well, so this money is not just sitting idle, it's going towards good use. So that's what we talked about as a Division I SAC, and personally how I favor the postgraduate concepts.
Thank you.
Noah, thank you very much for representing the Student Athlete Advisory Committee. It's clear that the committee's very engaged in the issues and understands a lot of the complexities, and we appreciate your representing those views. When you spoke earlier, you made a comment that you thought student athletes needed to be more accountable. Would you elaborate on that?
Sure. So in the transfer environment, we talked about student athletes being more accountable in their decision to transfer. I know Mr. Christian touched on student athletes being able to return to their institution if they decided to transfer and did not, get picked up or recruited, or for some reason it didn't end up working out. So we talk about this in terms of student athlete accountability, that we're adults, we're 18 to 22-year-olds, sometimes older. We need to take responsibility for our decisions and realize that our decisions do have consequences, and you can't put your institution, your teammates, your coaches in certain situations and expect everything to be all right at the end of the day.
Commissioners, we have one last opportunity for a question.
I was just curious, Jamian, you said that you start with your athletes sometimes age 15. The transfer swirl is all about, I think, athletics, not necessarily about a guided pathway, which is the common vernacular these days. Get a plan, stick with the plan, sort of on the point Chris was making. Do you think it's in the skill set of the NCAA and the coaches to help with that academic guided pathway when you're also talking to them at age 15 about performance and where they might play, and what you might think the NCAA role might be in better connecting with the high school experience?
Yeah, well, at age 15, I'm not necessarily just only talking to them about their ability to play. Again, I really believe in the collegiate model, so I believe that it's everything. It's from your friends and family having a chance to watch you play, but it's also about your teammates being in your wedding. There's a lot of experiences that come through there, being connected with the university from the time that you're really young and moving your way on through. You're also gaining a relationship with people who genuinely care about you and have the knowledge to help you achieve your dreams, whatever they may be. I think as you continue to move forward with it, just trying to understand that although they're men, their emotional understanding of things isn't always at the highest level. I'm just starting to get there myself, so I'm not blaming them. I'm just understanding of what you're doing. And so, and what was your second part of your question?
Wanted to see us pay a little bit more attention to the pipeline.
Yeah.
These athletes come through high school often, as all students do, a bit underprepared for college. And maybe if there were a game plan that were as academic as the performance game plan, starting earlier, that would help you help them.
Absolutely. There's two parts to that, to my answer to that. Number one, I think us growing more leaders into that market becomes very important. Obviously, Noah's so impressive. He's had some great leadership tutelage along the way. The more people we can put into the market that way that then become high school coaches or AAU coaches, the more beneficial it's going to be. So creating a leadership document that we routinely follow becomes really important and allows us to continue to grow that. And then secondly, I think just it's hard because the NCAA oversees some some programs, but they don't oversee all programs. So a lot of what we're running into when you get into a high school setting is there may be a counselor, there may be high schools that are unfamiliar with the NCAA rules because the NCAA rules are different than the normal college rules for admittance. So there's a miseducation gap there that we've got to continue to close. I think we've worked really hard on it over the last few years of helping it close, but there's still a gap there, and I think sometimes there's just, again, that miseducation really affects our student athletes.
Thank you all, panelists. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. We appreciate your perspectives. As we end this session, I want to remind the media that Arnie Duncan and I will hold a press conference in room 702 at 1 p.m. And all the panelists are welcome to join the Night Commission for lunch now in room 704. And thanks to everyone here today for attending this meeting of the Night Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics.